Chapter 9. Monday, May 17, Sup/Sup, 1852. We are camped on the south side of the South Platte River for the last time tonight. Tomorrow, we make the treacherous crossing. I can't deny that I'm nervous about the undertaking, but I do believe that we've found the safest place possible to cross the river. Amanda hurt her ankle today, and I have to say that I am more than a little angry with my wife over it. She approached the doctor, worried she couldn't pay for his services without even talking to me about it first. I have told her I have money, but she is unwilling to accept it. She's my wife. Why wouldn't she accept the funds I have? It makes absolutely no sense to me. I know she married me for my help on the trail, so why would financial help be so different? If we have children together, will she react the same way? Will she refuse to let me pay for anything? It is making me more than a little crazy. I consider those two little girls my daughters, and I would do anything for them. Why can't she see that? I know I shouldn't write this, and I hope no one ever reads it, but my wife is the most stubborn, unbending woman in the entire world, and I cannot help but love her with everything inside me. I just hope she comes to see me as her partner in life and not her adversary in everything she does. I pray tomorrow goes well, and we all make it safely across the river. But more than that, I pray that I am able to get through to my wife. I could force her to take the money, but it's not my way. I don't want to force anything about our relationship. I need her to accept me and all that I have willingly for things to work out between us. Someday, I hope she will come to understand that we are much stronger together than we are apart. They seemed to stop a little earlier than usual to Margaret, but as usual, she just wasn't sure. "Did we stop early?" she asked Jamie when she approached him after the wagons were in their normal circle. He nodded. "We're crossing here in the morning. We all need a good night's sleep to be ready for it. It's the narrowest place in the river according to Applegate's map, so we need to make the best of it. Thankfully the river doesn't seem high." Margaret looked across the expanse of water. "Here? It's not too deep?" It seemed very deep to her, and she was immediately worried about the perilous crossing. Not one person in their company was expendable. "We won't be walking. We'll be floating each of the wagons across." Jamie tried to act nonchalant about the danger involved, but he was filled with worry about it. He just didn't want her worrying as well. No good would come from that. "It looks dangerous." Margaret stared across the river at the camp there. Even knowing the men would be in charge of the crossing didn't make her feel any better about it. That meant Jamie was risking his life for her and her girls. "Oh, trust me. It's very dangerous, but if we want to reach Oregon, there are mountains we need to climb and rivers we have to cross." And he'd do it. He'd do anything for her and her girls. He'd swim across the river with them on his back if that's what it took. "Amanda's injured. I'll get Amanda across. Don't worry about that. We're not going to lose either of our daughters to the South Platte." Jamie was determined they'd all be fine, and they would be. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. "I trust you." He smiled. Those were the nicest words she'd ever said to him. Second best to only, "I love you," and he hoped and prayed every day those words were coming. "You can see that others have camped across the river from right here. We'll take the whole day getting the whole company across." She nodded. "Sounds like the smart way to do it." She stepped closer and dropped her voice. "Is Captain Bedwell complaining about how we're doing it?" She still worried the man would cause more trouble for the company, but he seemed to be biding his time. He's honestly said very little since he was removed from leadership. "How were his boys today?" "Those boys have never been so well behaved. I think they understood exactly what was happening." Margaret shrugged. "I don't think we'll have any more problems from them." At least she hoped they wouldn't. They all had enough on their minds on this long journey without worrying about children causing problems along the way. And what about the new family? Are they doing their share? He worried a bit that Katie wouldn't be able to do much. There wasn't much to do today, really. Just walking. We're all making sure Katie knows we want her with us. I think that's helping a little. Stanley seemed to be keeping up well. Jamie nodded. Stanley did great. I was impressed with the boy. He's young, but he's already feeling like he has the burden of his family on his shoulders. I'm glad he's taking things seriously. He hoped someone would help out the widow and her children, but he didn't know who. There were so many in their company who were suddenly widowed, and it was up to all of them to help one another, but especially the widows. Good. Margaret could see that this camp and the one across the river had been well used. Both had rings from campfires. It looks to me like this camp was used more than most. It was. Many companies would have spent several days here resting before crossing, or waiting for rains to stop or water to go down. The rivers will be the places people camp the longest. Margaret nodded, understanding completely. I'm going to go ahead and start supper. I'll milk the cows. I'm on guard duty this evening, but I should be back in time to put the girls to bed with you. It was his first turn at guard duty since the wedding. The company tried to give the newly married men a little time before they had to join the others in guarding the camp at night. She frowned. What about supper? She didn't like the idea of him going hungry while he was guarding everyone. He shrugged. I guess I'll take something with me, or if you and the girls feel like it, you can bring me something. We'll bring you something. Or Sally and I will. I'll find someone to watch after Amanda. Margaret was torn suddenly, and she didn't like it much. Her girls had been her only priority for months, and now she was worried about feeding a husband. It felt strange, but she all but heard Tom's voice telling her it was the right thing to do. Jamie nodded. Bob and I are on duty together. We won't head off for an hour or so yet. He wandered away to go and milk the cows. It would be good for her to have milk to cook supper with. Besides, the heifer got ornery when he was late milking. Margaret hadn't really paid attention to the guard duties that the men shared, because that night was the first time it had affected her at all. She was happy that Jamie was doing his part, but she'd feel so much safer when he was back with her and her girls. Safer for him, not for her. She had no idea what he might face out there with only Bob for a companion. For supper, she made a gravy out of jerky, flour, and milk, and she made rice to go with it. It wasn't the most nutritious thing she'd ever cooked, but she knew it would be a filling meal for her family and the extra people who joined them. Betty got there just as the meal was finished cooking, which was odd for her. Usually she was there to help cook. I helped Bernice cook so I could stay with Amanda while you take supper to Jamie. Margaret smiled. How did you know I was going to take supper to Jamie? She asked. Her friend knew her so well already. I've seen the way you look at the man. You fret over every little thing about him. You're not going to let him skip a meal. That's true. Margaret was stunned to realize that she was really thinking of Jamie as a husband now, and not just a man who was helping her and her girls. She fixed a plate of food, looking at her younger daughter. Do you want to take this to Daddy with me, or do you want to stay here and eat supper? At that moment, Margaret realized she was leaving Betty with all the men for supper for the first time. Jamie wouldn't even be there as a buffer. I want to eat, Sally said. I'm hungry. Then you stay and eat. You don't mind? Margaret asked Betty. Her friend would be in charge of both of her children while she was serving the men. It seemed like a lot to ask. Not at all. I'll make sure the girls are fed. Betty swallowed hard. And all the men. Don't be nervous. They just sit down and wait for their plates. Fix their plates for them and they'll eat. It's pretty simple. I know. Betty shrugged. But how can I not be nervous? Margaret smiled encouragingly before walking in the direction Jamie had told her he'd be. As she walked, she heard a musket go off, and she quickened her pace. It was coming from just ahead, and she worried that something could have happened to Jamie. What if someone had tried to attack the camp and he'd been shot? What if a wolf had attacked him and his shot had missed? It could be anything. Her fast walk turned into a run as she clutched the plate in both hands. It was a strange, awkward run, but a run nevertheless. She had to get to him and help him if he was hurt. She thought about calling for the doctor for a moment, but then she realized everyone would think her crazy if it turned out that nothing was wrong. When she spotted her husband standing 100 yards in front of her, she was able to slow her pace. "What was that?" she called out, relieved that he was still on his feet. If he was badly injured, he wouldn't be able to stand. Bob was the one to answer her. "Mary shot an antelope." Margaret had to laugh at herself. Mary had been shooting every critter they'd run across since they were still camped in Independence. She wasn't sure why she'd immediately thought of Jamie's safety and not the possibility of fresh meat. When she reached the men, she handed Jamie his plate of food. "It's not fresh meat," Margaret told him. "But it sounds like we'll have some of that soon." "We sure will," Mary called out. "I've never eaten an antelope. I can't wait." Mary rubbed her hands together in triumph. Margaret had never been one to want to hunt, but she knew her friend enjoyed it above all else. Jamie smiled at his wife. "Thank you for bringing me supper. Sally didn't want to walk with you?" He was surprised his wife hadn't brought their younger daughter. Sally usually wanted to go everywhere. She was hungry, so she stayed behind with Betty to eat. "Well, she does have priorities." Margaret laughed, still trembling a little from the fright she'd had since the moment the gun had gone off. "I need to get back to eat myself. You don't want me withering away, do you?" There was no doubt in her mind that her husband liked her body just the way it was. He'd shown her many times how much he liked it. Jamie eyed her curves appreciatively. "No need. Your curves are just perfect to me." Margaret gave him a saucy look before turning back toward their wagon, which was way across the camp. As she walked, her mind raced. She hadn't been worried that she would be alone with the girls again. She'd been worried for Jamie, the man she'd married. Her husband. "You love him, Margaret." She heard Tom's deep voice speaking to her as if he was really there. She shook her head. "I can't love him." "I love you." How could Tom even doubt her love for him after all they'd shared during their short years as man and wife? "Can you not love Sally because you loved Amanda first?" "I was your first love, and I'll always be your first love." "But Jamie, he's your forever love. The man saved you from a terrible situation, and now he's at your side every step of the way to Oregon. Don't forget me, but let yourself love again. There's no reason to think you can't love him." "It's not betraying you?" she asked softly. That was her biggest worry about being married again and always had been. She didn't want to betray her first love by loving Jamie. "Never. Our vows said we would be together till death. I died. Move on, Margaret. You need to keep living for you and the girls." She sighed heavily. Knowing Tom wasn't really there didn't make her feel any less like she'd had a conversation with him. Oh, she wouldn't tell anyone about it, because everyone would think her mad, though she knew she wasn't. Tom had given her his blessing, even if the words were only in her mind. And imaginary Tom was right. She did love Jamie. Asterisk. When Jamie returned to camp that night, he helped Margaret put the girls in bed. He kissed each of them on their forehead as he'd watched Margaret do so many times. "How's the ankle?" he asked Amanda softly. "It's better than it was, but it still hurts. Doc came and looked at it tonight, and he said I'm not allowed to walk tomorrow." Amanda pouted. "I want to play with my friends." "I know you do." Jamie shook his head. "If it helps at all, there will be little walking done by anyone tomorrow. We're going to float the wagons across the river." Despite the danger, the children would feel like it was a day of celebration. There would be no 20 miles of walking. They would stay in camp for the most part. "Maybe my friends will play sitting games with me." Amanda pouted. She obviously didn't want to play sitting games. She wanted to run and play with her friends as she usually did. "I have an idea." "I'll tell you in the morning," Jamie said. "You sleep well, and we'll talk tomorrow." Amanda nodded, yawning. When Jamie came out of the tent where the girls would sleep, Margaret asked Jamie what he had in mind. She knew her daughter would never forget that he had an idea, and she hoped he wasn't thinking Amanda would forget. "I bought some marbles for your girls right before we left Independence. I'd already fallen in love with the two of them by then, so it seemed like a good purchase. Then I put them in my wagon to save for when they got bored on the trail. I think tomorrow is the day we give them the marbles, but we let the girls know they're for special occasions." Margaret smiled, and her heart swelled with love for the man beside her. He had thought of her girls even before she'd agreed to marry him. "Thank you for thinking of my girls." "You're very welcome. It made me happy to think that I could solve some boredom issues down the road with them." He walked to the fire and sat down on the ground, waiting for her to join him. He needed to speak with her about something the doctor had said to him as he was on his way back to camp that evening. "The doctor told me you were worried about paying him for seeing to Amanda's ankle." Margaret shrugged. "Of course, I was. You know how little money I have. I wouldn't be selling baths or feeding the bachelors otherwise." Why would he even question that? She'd never made a secret of how little funds she had. "And I've made it very clear that I have enough to get us settled in Oregon. Why didn't you just tell me you were worried so I could pay for it?" They were married, and she needed to stop thinking that his money wasn't hers to spend. She sighed. "I feel like we already rely on you all the time. Asking you for money as well just seems to be too much." She couldn't bear to be a financial burden on him as well as a burden physically. He had to work much harder now that he was a husband and father than he had when he was a bachelor on the trail. She wasn't quite sure how, but she knew it had to be true. He shook his head. "But I'm your husband. I'm the father of those girls now, whether you like it or not. I know I'm not Tom, but I plan on staying married to you for the rest of our lives, and that means I'll be taking care of you and the girls financially from this point forward. I don't want us to be a burden." But she knew deep inside that they already were, whether he would admit to it or not. Jamie frowned. "Until you accept that I'm your husband and it's my responsibility to help you, there's no point in us even continuing discussing things. I'm tired of always being second best and not good enough to help you and your girls with the things that are unimportant. Like money." How would he ever be able to convince her that anything he had was hers if she only asked? "Money is only unimportant if you have some," Margaret responded. "You've never been destitute." "How would you know?" "You know nothing about me, because you never cared enough to learn." He got up and walked away, grabbing his musket for protection, and leaving her sitting there alone at their campfire. He knew his words for her were harsh, but he was feeling so lost and alone. How could being married be lonelier than being a bachelor? The woman would either learn that he was her husband and she could go to him with anything, or they would not be able to continue together. He'd never loved anyone the way he loved her, and he wanted to shake her. As Jamie stormed off, Margaret frowned. She'd just realized she loved the man, and he chose that moment to stalk off in a tiff? She'd planned to tell him her feelings, and instead, they'd had their first real argument as man and wife. She didn't know why he'd chosen that particular moment for his little tizzy, but she didn't want to have to deal with it for another minute. She climbed into the back of the wagon and pulled out her music box, knowing it was just the thing to calm her, but this time, it didn't. The music played on, and all she wanted to do was throw her most precious object out of the wagon and smash it. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped her music box in a sheet and tucked it into the bottom of a box. Even if it no longer calmed and soothed her, she needed to save it for her daughters. After hiding it away, she went looking for Betty. Her friend was reading by the Cauldron family's fire, just as she expected. "I need to lose myself in literature tonight," Margaret said without preamble. "I'm tired of being dirty and working my fingers to the bone on the stupid trail that leads to nowhere. I'm starting to think Oregon doesn't really exist." Betty frowned, but she pulled a book from a trunk in the back of the wagon. "If you want to talk, I'm open to it. If not, lose yourself in the words of James Fenimore Cooper. He's a favorite author of mine." "I'm not up for talking, but I thank you for the offer," Margaret said, taking the novel. "Thank you for the loan, and I'll return it soon." She walked back to their wagon, and instead of spending the next few hours brooding or worrying as Jamie was walking about who knew where and getting into all sorts of dangerous situations, she read several chapters, losing herself in the words of the great novelist. Margaret had heard of James Fenimore Cooper, of course, but it was her first occasion to read one of his novels. Thankfully, it took her mind off her husband's wanderings and put them right smack in the middle of someone else's troubles. That was the best thing about novels as far as she was concerned. She could read and forget all about life as it truly was, and imagine herself to be someone different. Chapter 10. Tuesday, May 18, Sup, th/Sup, 1852. Today we cross the South Platte River, and then we'll walk for many miles along the North Platte. The crossing looks dangerous, but Jamie has assured me he will take every precaution. He needs to, because he means so much to me. I never dreamed that a man I met on the Oregon Trail would be the man I would spend the rest of my life with, but that's just the case here. Amanda fell in a hole yesterday, and she hurt her ankle. Jamie gave her marbles this morning that he'd purchased for my girls back in Independence, planning to give them to the girls sometime during the journey. It's hard for me to believe that he was already thinking about my girls so soon after meeting us. I think he may love them even more than he loves me. Today will be a very hard day for the company, but for me, it's a day I will always remember. My heart feels so full, and I embrace the future for the first time since Tom's death. My future is Jamie. Now and forever. Early the following morning, before anyone else in camp had begun to stir, Margaret woke Jamie and walked onto the prairie with him. She knew that he needed less rest than most, as she did, so she didn't worry much about the sleep he'd lose. Besides, the conversation she needed to have with him was more important than sleep. When they were a decent distance from the camp, Margaret turned to Jamie. "I owe you an apology. Last night I was very angry when you were insisting that I should come to you with my money troubles, but I took some time and thought about it, and I realize you're right. We're married. I wouldn't have hesitated to go to Tom with trouble like that, but yet I keep my worries from you. That's going to stop." "Is it?" he asked. He was still angry, though he knew he needed to forgive her. At that moment, he simply didn't want to be kind. She nodded. "It really is. When Tom died, I had to learn that my girls and I could rely on no one but me. It was a hard lesson, and I felt as if I would fail so many times. I had always leaned on my husband and my parents before him, but suddenly there was no one left to lean on. My parents were no longer concerned unless they could get me out of their home quickly by marrying me off. His family acted as if the girls and I no longer existed." She took a deep breath. But none of that is your fault. You offered me a partnership in marriage, and I accepted it. It's time for me to put myself into it entirely, and stop worrying about how Tom would feel about certain things. She truly meant every word she said, and she poured her heart out to him, hoping he would be able to forgive her for the selfish way she'd acted. No, selfish wasn't the right word, she realized. Independent was better. But now she needed to be dependent on him. Jamie nodded. I'm a patient man, Margaret, but I can't spend the rest of my life feeling like I'm living in a dead man's shadow. I know you married Tom because you loved him, and you married me for help with the girls, but it's hard for me to feel like I pale in comparison to him. Margaret shook her head. But that's the problem. You don't. I didn't want to ever develop feelings for you because it felt like I was betraying Tom, but I've come to realize that it doesn't mean that at all. Feelings for you are just that. Feelings for you. She took a deep breath. I don't love Sally any less because Amanda came before her, so how could I love you less, simply because Tom came before you? That's the whole problem right there, though, Jamie said, shaking his head sadly. You still love Tom, and there's no room in your heart for me. He hoped someday there could be room, but at that moment, it felt like that day was forever away, much as it seemed like Oregon was never going to be reached. Yes, there is. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I love you, Jamie. She waited for him to say he loved her back, but the words didn't come. I find that really hard to believe, he said softly. If you love me, then you trust me with your troubles. When you worry about something, you come to me first, instead of going to the doctor. How could she not see that it was the right thing to do to approach him first? Margaret sighed, looking down at her feet, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know how to prove to you that I love you, but I will do my best. What else could she say? She'd told him of her feelings, and he didn't believe her. We need to get back to camp so I can fix breakfast. She felt like she'd been kicked in the face, and she had to wonder if that's how he'd been feeling since they married. Jamie felt a pang as he watched her turn and walk toward camp so dejectedly. How could she expect him to believe in her love when she'd made it clear her Tom would always come first? It made no sense to him at all. But why did she look so sad when he didn't believe her? He wanted to run to her and apologize, but he worried things would never change if he did that. No, he had to stay strong. As soon as they returned to camp, Margaret started a fire, and she made Johnny cakes and bacon, adding a tiny bit of her precious honey right into the Johnny cake batter to sweeten the treat. Jamie saw to the milking and carried Amanda out when breakfast was ready. Margaret handed Jamie his plate and asked, How dangerous do you think the crossing will be this morning? I don't want you hurt. She'd tried not to let herself think about it, but it filled her mind with terror. She'd lost one husband to a tragic accident, and she couldn't bear to lose another. He shrugged. It could go any number of ways. This river is tough, but it's not nearly as bad as the North Platte River or the Snake River crossing in Oregon Territory. We've all done this before, and we're going to be as careful as we possibly can. It won't do any good to fret over it, though. He pointed at several crosses sticking out of the ground on the other side of the river. There's a small graveyard over there where men have perished. That warning will help us tread carefully. I will be praying. She was terrified of losing him. Not because she didn't want to be left to fend for herself and her girls alone again, but because she loved him. She knew he didn't want to hear it, so she didn't speak the words aloud, but she'd make sure he knew later, when he was ready to listen. She hoped he would soon be ready to listen. Thank you, he said softly. He truly did feel better knowing she cared enough to pray for him. And all the other men who would be making the treacherous crossing with him, of course. She wasn't singling him out. As soon as breakfast was over, he climbed into the wagon and found the marbles. He took them to Amanda, where she sat on the ground beside the campfire. I know you don't want to have to sit today while the other children play, but I wanted you to have these. I bought them for you before we left Independence. Amanda opened the drawstring pouch and stared at the small round spheres. What do I do with them? Jamie sat back on his haunches for a moment, shocked that the girl didn't know how to play marbles. He glanced around and saw that most families were still getting ready for the river crossing, so he had a little time. Carefully, he drew a circle with a stick in the dirt. You want to use one marble like this, and he demonstrated, shooting it with his thumb. Then you knock the other person's marbles out of the circle. Usually you play with people who have their own marbles, and you win their marbles or they win yours. Amanda frowned. I don't want to lose them. They're a present from you. He laughed. I don't think the other children here have marbles, so that doesn't really matter. You'll just share yours and keep them all at the end of the day. He loved that she considered a present from him precious. And I have something to do while I can't walk. Amanda had obviously just understood why he'd chosen that day to give her the small treasures. When Jamie glanced over at Margaret, he saw that she was watching him with her girls, and tears were flowing down her face. He frowned, unsure why she was upset with him for giving the girls a gift. She had to get used to him acting like a father with the children, because he wasn't about to stop, no matter how much it bothered her. He walked to her, took her plate from her hands, and pulled her away from camp, needing to have this out with her. There was no way they were going to be able to continue their journey without clearing the air, and he felt like this was the only time they had left. Despite him telling her there was no use worrying, he wasn't sure he'd make it past the river that day. He wasn't sure any of them would. The future wasn't guaranteed, especially when traveling on the Oregon Trail. We don't have long to talk, he said, but I don't understand why you're upset about me giving the girls a gift. I told you I was going to give them the marbles last night. He crossed his arms over his chest, ready for whatever response she had. As their father, it's my right to give them gifts. Surely, she had to see that what he said was right. I agree with you, Margaret said softly. I think you have every right to give them whatever gifts you choose to. And she hoped he would continue to do so. She would never tire of watching him with their children. He was born to be a father. Then why are you upset with me? He started to add again, but he knew that would only make things worse. I'm not. Margaret wasn't certain how to explain to him that she was moved by the sight of him with her girls. She wasn't bothered by it. Jamie frowned. But you're crying. Why would she cry if she wasn't upset? I was touched by the sight of you being so tender with the girls. The man I love is showing love for my babies, and it pleases me. The tears were happy tears. The sooner he learned that tears could mean almost anything, the better they would get along. You need to stop telling me you love me. I don't want to hear it because I know it's not true. Jamie had ached for those words from her lips, but now that she was saying them, he knew that she was only doing it to placate him and make him feel better about not approaching him for money the previous day. I don't know how to convince you that it is true. Jamie, when I was walking to take you your supper last night, I heard a gunshot, and all I could think about was losing you. There was no thought in my mind of me or the girls, or what we'd do if you died. My thoughts were entirely on the idea of not having you in my life anymore. Not having you as my partner. Not being able to make love with you when we find time to sneak away from camp. Not being able to lie close to you when I sleep at night. He shook his head, having a hard time believing her. How could she be telling the truth? It's true, Jamie. I didn't realize it until I walked back from camp last night, but now I know it's true with everything inside of me. I love you, not just as someone to help me. Not just as someone to support me and my girls. I love you, Jamie Prewitt. You make me happy in every way. Except when you won't believe that I love you, that is. That makes me sad. Jamie stared at her dumbstruck for a moment. Margaret had never lied to him, and he had no reason to believe she'd start now, but could she really love him? He realized trust had to go both ways. She'd trusted him enough to apologize for her behavior and declare her love. Now it was his turn to trust her. "I've loved you from the moment I set eyes on you in the general store in Independence. You said you were going on the Oregon Trail with your girls, and you purchased everything the merchant told you to purchase. And I bought the girls the marbles after you left the store. At that moment, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you, and I prayed with everything inside me that you didn't have a husband waiting somewhere." Margaret brushed away a tear, staring at him. "I didn't love you that soon. It's been gradual for me. Love came so slowly, but it came. I think I loved you before we ever made love, but I couldn't admit it even to myself. I only knew that I wanted you desperately. I wanted to make love with you, and I wanted to be a real wife to you." Jamie opened his arms for her, and she rushed into them. "I didn't think I'd ever hear you say those words to me, but now that you have, I don't know how I ever lived without them. You and the girls, you mean everything to me, Margaret." He stroked her back, never wanting to let go. They weren't far enough from camp to not be seen, but Margaret didn't care. She pulled his head down for a kiss. "Thank you for coming into my life and making everything right again, Jamie. I was so lost, but you're my rock." And she wasn't ever going to let him get away now that she'd found him. He kissed her forehead tenderly, just as he had the girls so many times. "I don't know what I've done in my life to deserve you and your love, but I'm so glad I did it." Together, they walked back toward camp. "I need to start helping with the river crossing. You finished getting everything ready in our wagon." "You remember how?" he asked. They'd had to do it when crossing the Missouri, so he knew she at least had some experience. "Of course. When it's our turn, we'll be ready." They'd led the train the day before, so today, they would be last, crossing the river. They would cross, and the men would have experience doing it by the time it was their turn. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the love she felt for Jamie and her girls. They were a true family now, and they always would be. As he walked away from her, Margaret admired her husband and thought about how good he was to her and her girls, and she prayed they would soon have a baby of their own. A little boy with Jamie's brown eyes. That would make their family truly complete. She'd gone from someone who hadn't anyone in the world other than her girls just months before to a woman who was loved and surrounded by friends. The Oregon Trail was filled with hardship, but for her, it was also filled with love beyond measure.